Welcome to our journey tonight, where we explore what it was like to be a billionaire in the Roman Empire. Now, find your most comfortable spot. Go on, get settled in. Let your shoulders relax and take a slow, deep breath, allowing the noise of your day to fade into a gentle hum. Where are you listening from, I wonder? Tucked away in a quiet room? And what time is it for you? Late evening? Or perhaps you are stealing a moment before your perfectly organized chaos of a morning begins. Wherever and whenever you are, I am so glad you're here. If you enjoy these quiet travels through time, a simple follow or subscribe ensures we can always find each other for the next story. Now, let your mind drift. We are traveling far, far back. Imagine you are standing not in your room, but in a grand villa. Below you, the 7 hills of a great city bustle with life. The distant sounds of merchants and craftsmen echo up from the winding streets, where fortunes are made and lost with every passing day. The red soil of Etruria felt different under the soles of Lucius Cornelius Afer's expensive sandals. It was richer, darker, and heavier than the tired earth of his family's ancestral lands closer to Rome. He bent down, letting a handful of it run through his fingers. It was the soil of conquest, paid for not with the clink of old family coin, but with the silence that followed a brutal civil war. He could still picture the lists posted in the forum, the columns of names belonging to men declared enemies of the state. Their lives were forfeit, their properties seized and sold for almost nothing to men like him, men who had chosen the winning side. This vast expanse of rolling hills, now legally his, was the dividend of that correct choice. The memory brought no guilt, only a grim satisfaction. Wealth, he knew, was the armor of the Republic, and he was forging himself the strongest suit imaginable. This understanding of wealth was taking physical form on the rise overlooking the valley. There, the foundations of his new villa were being cut into the earth, a sprawling design that would dwarf any of the old farmhouses in the region. A team of surveyors had spent a month using their sighting tools, wooden frames with weighted strings called gromas, to ensure every angle was perfect. Now, hundreds of newly purchased slaves moved with a weary but steady rhythm, hauling stone from a nearby quarry and mixing mortar in deep pits. Lucius watched them, not as individual men, but as a single, powerful tool. Their sweat was the price of his comfort, their ceaseless labor the engine of his legacy. He had plans for this place, for groves of olive trees and fields of grain that would feed the city and fill his coffers for generations to come. This was not a home, it was an enterprise. Such an enterprise depended entirely on water. A small, lively stream flowed down from the hills, bisecting his new property before winding its way toward the lands of his neighbors. His architects had already drawn the plans for a series of channels and a reservoir that would divert nearly all of it to irrigate his future olive groves. The olives from this region, when pressed into oil, fetched a high price in the markets of Rome and beyond. The stream was not just water, it was the lifeblood of his entire financial venture. He walked its bank, crushing wild mint under his heel and breathing in the sharp, clean scent. The sound of the water tumbling over smooth gray stones was the sound of future prophets, a steady and reassuring music for his ambitions. It was by that stream he first saw the old farmer. The man was small and stooped, his tunic patched and faded to the color of the dust. He stood beside a simple wooden boundary post, his hands gnarled around a staff, his face a mask of worry etched by years of working the land. He did not approach Lucius with the deference of a slave or the swagger of an equal, but with the quiet desperation of a man on the verge of losing everything. When Lucius drew near, the farmer inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt centuries old. He introduced himself as Manius, and said his family had farmed their small plot just beyond the boundary marker for more generations than anyone could count. He was a relic, a reminder of a time when Rome was a city of men who worked their own small parcels of land. The farmer's plea was simple and direct. He explained that the stream was the only source of water for his own modest fields and for his few animals. For centuries, he claimed, all the local farms had shared its flow, each taking only what was needed. He spoke not of legal rights, but of tradition and neighborly duty, the unspoken laws that had governed these hills long before the civil wars had redrawn the maps of ownership. He pointed with a trembling finger toward the foundations of Lucius's great villa. A house that large must have a thirsty master, the old man said, his voice raspy. But my land has a thirst that has been known to this stream since the time of the kings. Surely a man of your stature can spare some of its water for a neighbor. Lucius listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. A part of him, the part that remembered his own grandfather's stories of farming a small plot, felt a flicker of something akin to sympathy. The old ways had a certain simple honor to them. However, the man who had survived years of political turmoil and profited from the ruin of others knew that sentiment was a weakness. To concede the water would be to show that his resolve could be softened by an appeal to tradition. It would invite other challenges, other neighbors asking for small favors that would, piece by piece, eat away at the efficiency of his estate. True power was not in the having, but in the absolute control of what one had. He saw the situation not as a matter of sharing, but as a test of his authority. He made his decision in an instant, choosing the cold logic of profit over the warmth of local peace. He looked from the farmer to the boundary post, a fresh stone marker put in place by his own surveyors. "Old man," Lucius began, his voice calm and even, "the laws of Rome are clear. This marker, registered with the magistrates in the city, defines my property. The stream, where it crosses my land, belongs to me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I will need all of it for my groves. I am sorry for your difficulty, but the law is the law." There was no anger in his tone, only the finality of a closing door. It was the same detached resolve he had felt when reading the proscription lists in the Forum. The farmer seemed to shrink, the last bit of hope draining from his face. He understood completely. He had no money to hire lawyers in Rome, no powerful friends to plead his case. His world of tradition and unspoken agreements had just collided with the unyielding force of recorded law and immense wealth, and it had been shattered. He gave Lucius a long, slow look, a look not of hatred, but of profound and weary comprehension. Without another word, he turned and shuffled back toward his small farm, a man walking away from a future that had just been taken from him. Lucius watched him go for a moment before turning his attention back to the grand construction on the hill. The sounds of the work camp, the rhythmic thud of hammers on stone, and the calls of the overseers drifted down the valley. The farmer was a minor annoyance, already fading from his thoughts. He had a fortune to build, a legacy to secure. The stream would be diverted next week. Across the Etrurian hills, the sounds of his new world being built continued their steady, relentless rhythm. 15 years had passed since Lucius Cornelius Afer first walked his new lands in Etruria, the soil dark with promise. In that time, the wealth from those olive groves and grain fields had flowed steadily toward Rome, funding a life of comfort and influence. For his son Marcus, that wealth was not a prize to be guarded, but a tool to be wielded. He moved through the city's crowded throughways, the press of bodies a constant reminder of the prize he sought. Shouts from vendors selling everything from roasted chickpeas to cheap pottery mixed with the endless murmur of conversations, creating a constant hum that vibrated through the soles of his sandals. He felt a fine layer of grit on his skin from the dusty streets and wiped a trickle of sweat from his temple before it reached his eye. His goal was the office of aedile, a magistrate post responsible for the city's upkeep and, more importantly, its public games, a critical stepping stone to real power. This path, however, was proving more costly than he had imagined. His chief rival, a man from an old family with deep coffers, had just sponsored a day of chariot races that had the whole city talking. Consequently, Marcus found his own promises of future spectacles falling on increasingly skeptical ears. To reclaim the people's attention, he required something truly unforgettable, something that would stamp his name onto the city's memory. This meant securing beasts for the arena that had never been seen before, creatures from the farthest corners of the world. Therefore, he made his way toward the grimy warehouses near the Tiber, where the ships from Alexandria and Carthage unloaded their exotic cargoes. The usual city smells of baking bread and overflowing sewers gave way to the sharp, foreign scent of wild animals, a mixture of fur, fear, and filth that caught in the back of his throat. Inside a shaded courtyard, surrounded by stout wooden cages, Marcus met with a trader whose sun-weathered skin spoke of long voyages. The man gestured toward a pair of leopards, their spotted coats rippling as they paced restlessly. He spoke of immense bears from the dark forests of the north and crocodiles hauled from the muddy banks of the Nile. Each creature represented a staggering cost, not just for the animal itself, but for its capture and transport across the seas. The trader, sensing Marcus's desperation, named a price that made his stomach tighten. It was more than he had budgeted for the entire games. He argued, he postured, he spoke of his family's influence. But the merchant merely shrugged. The beasts were rare, and another ambitious man would surely pay the price if he would not. Leaving the trader with a non-committal promise to return, Marcus felt a surge of frustration. The wealth his father had so carefully accumulated felt like water slipping through his fingers. To bolster his standing, he moved on to his next task, overseeing the public distribution of grain. Near the Porticus Aemilia, a vast warehouse, a long line of citizens snaked through the street. each person clutching a token that entitled them to a measure of grain from the Cornelii estates. Marcus stood with his assistants, offering a brief word or a nod to the recipients. He saw the gratitude in some faces, but also the blank-eyed acceptance in others. This was not a gift. It was an expectation. This act of generosity, however necessary, would be forgotten by morning, overshadowed by the next spectacle or the next handout from another wealthy patron.
The experience solidified a troubling thought in his mind. His current resources were simply not enough. His rival was not just spending money, he was spending it faster and more visibly. The Roman people were a vast, hungry beast, and their appetite for entertainment and sustenance was bottomless. To truly win them over, to secure the election and the future it promised, he would have to go beyond the limits of his family's income. He needed a massive infusion of coin, and he needed it now. The decision led him away from the clamor of the public spaces and into the quieter, more menacing world of high finance. He walked toward the Forum, the heart of Roman commerce and law, his steps heavier than they had been that morning. He found himself standing before the offices of Publius Crassus, a man known throughout Rome for his immense wealth and the ruthlessly high interest he charged on his loans. The building was austere, lacking the gilded decorations favored by many of the newly rich. Its plain stone facade seemed to absorb the sounds of the city, creating an unnerving quiet within. Inside, the air was cool against his skin, a welcome relief from the warmth of the streets. Slaves moved silently across mosaic floors that depicted scenes of mythological commerce, a subtle reminder of the owner's power. Marcus was led into a small, sparsely furnished room, where Crassus sat behind a large wooden table, his eyes missing nothing. The man listened to Marcus's request without expression, his fingers steepled before him. Crassus did not bother with pleasantries. He knew of Marcus's campaign, his rival, and the state of the Cornelii family finances. After a long silence that stretched Marcus's nerves to their breaking point, he named his terms. The loan would be substantial enough to fund games that would dwarf anything his rival could imagine. The interest rate, however, was punishingly high. As collateral, Crassus demanded a lien against the entirety of the Cornelii estates in Etruria, the very foundation of his family's fortune. The request felt like a physical blow. The land his father had secured, the source of their power and status, would be forfeit if he failed. He envisioned his father's disappointment, the shame of losing what had been won with such effort.
For a moment, Marcus was paralyzed by the sheer scale of the risk. He thought of the old farmer his father had displaced to secure a stream, a small act of ruthlessness for a secure gain. What he was contemplating was a gamble of a far greater magnitude. Failure would not mean a small loss, it would mean ruin. His entire family, their name, their future, it would all be swept away, consumed by this single political contest. He could refuse, of course. He could run a respectable, fiscally responsible campaign, lose with dignity, and preserve his inheritance. He could live the rest of his life as a wealthy, but ultimately insignificant senator. The thought was unbearable. The allure of power, the intoxicating possibility of standing before the Senate as a consul one day was too strong to resist. That ambition, funded by the very wealth his father had acquired, now demanded he risk it all. He had been raised to believe that the Corneli family was destined for greatness, and greatness was never achieved through caution. His father had seized his opportunity in the chaos of a civil war. This election was Marcus's own battlefield. He looked across the table at the moneylender, the man who held the key to his future, and saw not a threat, but an instrument. With a steady hand, he reached for the stylus and the wax tablet that contained the terms of the loan. He pressed the sharp point into the dark wax, his signature stark and clear. The act felt final, a point of no return. He was no longer just the son of a wealthy senator. He was a player in the great game of Rome, and he had just wagered everything he had. Handing the tablet back to Crassus, he felt a strange sense of release. The anxiety that had plagued him for weeks was replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The path ahead was now clear. He would give the people of Rome a spectacle they would speak of for generations, and he would build his political career on a mountain of borrowed coin. The cost was a problem for another day. As he walked back out into the bustling forum, the sounds of the city seemed different. The roar of the crowd was no longer a vague noise, but a challenge he had just accepted. Every face in the crowd was a potential voter, a person whose loyalty he now had the funds to purchase. He felt a surge of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He would not fail. He would secure the finest beasts, the most skilled gladiators, and the most lavish feasts. His name would be on everyone's lips, and the office of aedile would be his. The wealth of his family had given him the opportunity, but it would be his own nerve, his willingness to risk it all, that would ultimately bring him victory. The risk, he reasoned, was the very heart of being Roman. The Republic itself had been built by men who gambled on uncertain futures, who threw their lives and fortunes into the balance for a chance at glory. His father had done it for land. He would do it for power. It was the same impulse, merely playing out on a different stage. The noise, the smells, and the sheer human energy of Rome swirled around him, not as a chaotic mess, but as the raw material of his ambition. He was now deeply in debt, his family's legacy hanging by a thread, but for the first time in months, he felt truly in control of his own destiny. The cool weight of the loan receipt in the pouch at his belt was a constant, tangible reminder of his choice. It was both a burden and a promise, a symbol of the immense danger he had invited and the glorious future he intended to seize. The memory of the moneylender's quiet, calculating gaze lingered as Marcus considered the fortune he had just wagered on the cheers of a fickle crowd. The port of Puteoli was a world built from noise and haste. Felix, once a slave in the quiet, ordered household of the Cornelii, now navigated this chaos as its master. The sharp scent of brine and drying nets mingled with the aroma of spices from distant Egypt and the sweat of laborers hauling amphorae from creaking ships. Here, a man's worth was not measured by the names of his ancestors, but by the number of vessels he commanded and the speed at which their cargoes sold in the teeming market. Felix ran his import business with the same quiet efficiency he had learned managing the senator's accounts, a skill that had earned him his freedom and a small inheritance. Because of this, his fortune had grown steadily, yet he felt a persistent unease, as if he were wearing clothes that did not quite fit. This feeling sharpened when the invitation arrived. It was not a simple wax tablet, but a sliver of polished ivory, delivered by a servant whose livery was more colorful than a senator's toga. The message from Gaius Vibius Fortunatus, another freedman whose wealth was the talk of the waterfront, was an summons to dinner. Felix knew of Fortunatus, a man who had made a colossal fortune in shipping fish sauce from Spain. Accepting was a necessity for business, as Fortunatus controlled access to several key shipping syndicates. Despite this, Felix hesitated, tracing the overly ornate letters with his finger. He remembered the dinners at the Cornelii villa, simple fare from their own lands, quiet conversation, and an unspoken understanding of tradition and restraint that felt a world away from the rumors that swirled around men like Fortunatus. Upon arriving at the villa that evening, Felix's senses were immediately overwhelmed. The entryway was not decorated with the customary busts of sober-faced ancestors, but with life-sized statues of Hercules, all gleaming in polished bronze and wrestling mythological beasts. Music, played on a clashing assortment of pipes and lyres, spilled from the dining hall, too loud and too fast. Servants, far more numerous than necessary, rushed past, their movements lacking the graceful economy of the Cornelii household staff. Fortunatus himself greeted Felix not with a formal nod, but with a heavy arm thrown around his shoulders, his fingers heavy with jeweled rings that dug into Felix's tunic. The man smelled powerfully of imported rose oil, a scent so strong it made Felix's nose itch. The dining room itself was a spectacle of deliberate excess. Guests, all men of new money like himself, reclined on couches draped in vibrant purple cloth, a color once reserved for the highest magistrates. They did not speak, they shouted, their laughter booming as they boasted of recent profits. Fortunatus bellowed for more wine, which was served not in simple terracotta or silver, but from massive glass bowls encrusted with uncut gems that glittered in the light of 100 oil lamps. The sheer number of lamps made the room uncomfortably warm, and Felix felt a line of perspiration trickle down his back as he took his assigned place. He watched as a man across from him loudly recounted how he had purchased a famous philosopher for his household, not to hear his teachings, but to have someone to mock during dinner. The food began to arrive, each dish a performance. A whole roasted peacock was carried in, its iridescent tail feathers carefully reattached to create a fantastic display. Following this came a platter of dormice, fattened on nuts, which were then rolled in honey and poppy seeds before being served. Felix, accustomed to the simple, high-quality meals of his former life, fresh bread, cheese from the estate, wine from their own vines, found his stomach turning. He picked at a small piece of fish, its taste completely lost beneath a heavy, exotic sauce made from ingredients he could not name. His host, seeing his hesitation, laughed loudly. "Not to your liking, Felix? This sauce came all the way from the Indus. It cost me more than a legionary makes in a year." This declaration turned the conversation, as Fortunatus had intended, back to money. One man bragged about the mosaics in his new bathhouse, describing in detail the price of each individual colored stone. Another announced that his favorite racehorse was now worth more than a Tuscan farm. It was a competition of consumption, where every object's value was defined solely by its cost. Felix remained silent, remembering Senator Lucius Cornelius Afer, his first master, who would wear the same simple woolen toga for years until it was threadbare. For the senator, wealth was a tool for securing power and legacy, a silent foundation, not a glittering spectacle to be waved in the faces of others. Here it was the only thing that mattered. He wondered if this was the only path forward for a man like him. Had he escaped the formal bonds of servitude only to enter a new kind of cage, one gilded with the garish displays of men who were desperate to prove they belonged? He thought of his small but successful business, built on reliability and fair dealing, methods he had learned from the old Roman aristocracy. But the men in this room were building empires of commerce through bold risks, loud self-promotion, and alliances forged over gem-studded wine bowls. They saw his quiet competence not as a strength, but as a peculiar shyness, perhaps even a weakness to be exploited. The pressure to participate became unavoidable when Fortunatus turned to him directly. "Felix, my friend, your ships from Alexandria bring the finest Egyptian grain. But my associate here tells me you trade only with the old families. Why not join us? We are financing a new fleet to corner the pepper trade from India. The profits will be legendary." All eyes turned to him. The room fell quiet for the first time, the men waiting to see how the reserved freedman of the Cornelii would respond. Felix felt the weight of their collective gaze. He could feel the familiar, calculated austerity he had absorbed for decades, warring with the raw, chaotic ambition that pulsed in the warm room. He found himself at a crossroads. To decline would be seen as an insult, marking him as an outsider who did not understand the new rules of commerce. It would close doors he desperately needed to open if his business was to survive, let alone thrive. Yet to accept, to join in their loud boasts and risky ventures, felt like a betrayal of the very principles that had guided him to this point. It felt like trading one form of servitude for another, becoming a slave to this endless, noisy pursuit of more. He thought of his own home, clean and orderly, and the simple satisfaction of a ledger that balanced perfectly at the end of the day. Taking a slow sip of the overly sweet wine, he offered a careful, non-committal response. "The venture sounds promising, Fortunatus. A man would be a fool not to consider such an opportunity. My resources are committed for the season, but let us speak again when my ships return." It was a politician's answer, one he had heard the old senator use many times. It was neither acceptance nor refusal, a small island of dignity in an ocean of excess. Fortunatus seemed to accept it, slapping him on the back again before his attention was captured by the arrival of a troupe of Syrian dancers. The noise swelled once more, releasing Felix from the spotlight. Later, walking home through the cool, quiet streets of Puetioli, the salt-tinged air felt clean in his lungs. The sounds of the harbor were a gentle rhythm compared to the harsh mix of sounds from the party. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone over the Cornelia villa, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was no longer a slave, and he was not yet one of these new kings of commerce. He was something in between, a man navigating a world where the old virtues of duty and restraint were being washed away by a tide of gold. He reached his own doorway, the simple wooden frame a comforting sight. Inside, his house was dark and silent. He poured himself a cup of water from a plain clay jug, the taste clean and pure on his tongue after the cloying sweetness of Fortunatus's wine. His freedom, he realized, was not a destination he had arrived at, but a journey he was still on. Its path was unclear, and he was not certain he would recognize the man he would have to become to complete it. In these quiet moments, alone in his home, Felix could almost forget the crushing weight of a society that demanded a man shout his worth from the rooftops. He wondered how long he could afford to whisper. He was free, but the price of maintaining that freedom in this new world was something he was only just beginning to understand, and he feared it might be more than he was willing to pay. Decimus felt the grit of fine red dust between his teeth, a constant reminder that he was a world away from the familiar damp cobblestones of Puteoli. He pressed a hand against the warm, rose-colored rock of the canyon wall, seeking a moment of stability in the overwhelming press of bodies and animals. Camels, their breath smelling of fermented grass, groaned under heavy loads of bundled silks and clay jars, their bells adding a dull, rhythmic chime to the harsh mix of sounds from countless merchants haggling in languages that slipped past his ear like running water. To navigate this city of Petra was to move through a living quarry, a place carved directly from the blushing stone of the earth itself, where every grand temple facade and humble doorway was part of the surrounding cliffs. His linen tunic, once crisp, was now limp and clung to his back, a testament to the effort it took just to breathe and walk in this narrow, sun-drenched passage. This journey, however, was not for his own pleasure, but in service to another's. He worked for Felix, the freedman whose fortunes were now tied to the desires of Rome's wealthiest families, including the powerful Cornelii. Decimus carried their appetites in his mind like a ledger. The finest frankincense for offerings in their private household shrines, rare myrrh for perfumes and medicines, and cinnamon bark from lands so distant they were spoken of only in whispers. These were not mere goods, they were symbols, the essential ingredients of status that separated the merely rich from the truly influential. His mission was simple in its instruction, but monumental in its execution. Secure a contract for a steady supply, bypassing the lesser traders to deal directly with the source, and ensure the price reflected the volume Felix intended to purchase. Failure meant disappointing a man who rarely forgot a debt, whether of coin or of loyalty. Following his guide, a short, wiry Nabatean man whose skin was the color of weathered leather, Decimus entered a sprawling courtyard where the real business took place. Here, the air was different. The scent of livestock and sweat mingled with the sharp, clean fragrance of raw spices piled high in wicker baskets. He saw men with dark, coiled beards discussing figures with gestures as much as words, their fingers tracing numbers in the dust. The guide led him not to one of these merchants, but toward a group of men dressed in stark white robes, their expressions serene and unreadable. These were not simple traders. Decimus recognized the stillness of priests, men who measured value not in silver denarii alone, but in devotion. It was they, his guide explained in halting Latin, who controlled the most sacred groves where the highest quality frankincense, the pale, tear-shaped resin fit for an emperor, was harvested. The chief priest, a man with eyes as dark and ancient as the stone around them, listened patiently as Decimus, through his guide, made his offer. He spoke of shiploads, of long-term agreements, of the endless hunger of Rome for the sense of the East. The priest nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Decimus's face, as if weighing the Roman's soul rather than his words. When Decimus finished, the priest spoke in his own tongue, the sounds soft yet firm. The translation was unsettling. The finest incense was a gift from their god, Dushara, and it could not simply be sold like common pottery. To prove his respect, to be worthy of such a divine commodity, Decimus would be expected to join them in a ritual of gratitude at the high temple that evening. It was not a request, but a condition of the entire contract. A knot tightened in Decimus's stomach. He was a Roman. His gods were Jupiter, Mars, and the quiet spirits of his own hearth and ancestors. He understood business, contracts, and the clear exchange of coin for goods. This, however, was something else entirely. The thought of bowing before a foreign god, of mimicking chants in a language he did not understand, felt like a betrayal, a chipping away at his own identity. He could refuse, of course. He could walk away and try to secure a lesser quality supply from the boisterous merchants in the main market. But that was not his instruction. Felix had demanded the best, the kind of product that would make the name of his trading house whispered with reverence in the villas on the Palatine Hill. He wrestled with the choice, the murmuring of the courtyard fading into a distant hum. Part of him, the Roman part that valued custom and propriety above all, recoiled from the priest's demand. Yet the other part, the part that had been shaped by Felix's relentless ambition, knew that the world was changing. Commerce was its own kind of faith, and its holiest places were not temples, but ports and markets. The flow of wealth from the provinces to Rome was a sacred river, and he was one of its keepers. To refuse would be to dam that river out of mere personal discomfort. The image of Felix's disappointment, A quiet, cold look that was far worse than any shouted anger solidified his resolve. Commerce would have to be his god today. That evening, as the sky turned a deep violet, Decimus found himself standing barefoot on cool stone inside a vast chamber carved from the mountain. The air was thick with the very scent he had come to purchase, a sweet, woody smoke that made his eyes water slightly. The priests began a low, rhythmic chant, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. Decimus, awkward and conspicuous in his Roman tunic, tried to follow their movements, bowing his head when they bowed, placing a hand over his heart as they did. He felt a profound sense of alienation, a hollow performance for an audience of one silent, unseen deity he did not believe in. He focused on the details, the way the resin beads hissed and melted on the hot coals, the intricate patterns carved into the altar, the feel of the polished floor beneath his feet. He kept his mind fixed on the practicalities, transforming the strange ritual into a column of figures in his head. This discomfort was the true price of the frankincense. This moment of compromised dignity was the down payment on a contract that would enrich Felix, and by extension, himself. It was the cost of connecting the insatiable desires of one world with the sacred traditions of another. As he inhaled the fragrant smoke, he was no longer a man in a temple, but an agent sealing a deal. He was a small, necessary gear in the immense machine of the Roman economy, a machine that cared little for the beliefs of men, only for the goods they could provide. The ritual was simply another form of negotiation, and he was determined to see it through. The next morning, the contract was signed. Parchment and ink replaced chanting and incense as the instruments of agreement. The chief priest, his expression as placid as it had been the day before, accepted a portion of the payment in gold, the rest to be delivered upon the safe arrival of the first shipment. As Decimus walked back through the city's main passage, the sick, the sounds of the merchants and the bleating of animals seemed different. He was no longer just an observer of this foreign world. He had participated in it, bent his own customs to accommodate it, all for the sake of a transaction. He felt neither pride nor shame, only the quiet satisfaction of a difficult task completed. The demands of the Cornelii family in their cool marble villas had reached across seas and deserts to this city of stone, compelling him to bow to a god he did not know. He ran a hand over a leather pouch at his belt, feeling the small, hard beads of the sample resin inside. This was the prize. This was what would perfume the homes of senators and be offered to Roman gods in Roman temples. He wondered how many of his countrymen ever considered the journey these small, fragrant tears had taken. Did they ever imagine the red dust, the foreign chants, the necessary compromises made by men like him in far-off lands? Or was it simply a scent, a familiar part of the luxury that they considered their birthright? He suspected he knew the answer. The machine was too large, its workings too complex for any one person to grasp entirely. As his own caravan prepared to depart, loaded with the first precious crates, Decimus took one last look at the magnificent treasury facade, its details glowing in the morning light. The city of Petra, with its strange gods and shrewd priests, was now a part of his own story, a link in a chain that stretched all the way to the heart of the empire. The goods of the world did not simply appear in the markets of Rome. They were pulled there by a gravity of wealth so immense it could bend traditions and blur the boundaries between the sacred and the commercial. He had felt that force himself, bowing his head in a stone-carved temple miles from home. The sweet, heavy scent of frankincense, he realized, was not just a luxury for the wealthy elite in the capital. The pursuit of it had woven itself so completely into the fabric of Roman commerce that it now demanded its own form of tribute, not just of gold, but of custom. He turned away from the stone city and began the long journey back toward the sea, carrying with him the smell of a god he did not worship, destined for a city that would consume it without a second thought. The river of wealth continued to flow, and he was merely one of the many unseen currents that kept it moving. The cool of the marble floors was a welcome relief against the soles of Cornelia's sandals. Outside the shaded portico, the day was bright and still, and the city's endless murmur was a distant hum from their high perch on the Palatine Hill. From here, one could almost forget the press of the million souls below. Her household, however, was a city in miniature, and she was its undisputed ruler. With a subtle gesture, she indicated a vase of Egyptian lilies whose water needed changing. The nearest servant, a girl from Syria, bowed her head and moved to obey without a word. This was the rhythm of Cornelia's life, a world managed through quiet glances and soft commands, an intricate dance of duties performed by a staff so numerous she barely knew all their names. The vast wealth of the Cornelii family was not a treasure to be counted, but an organism to be managed, and she was its heart. This organism required constant attention. Later that morning, she met with the tutor, a severe-looking Greek named Hermogenes, to discuss her younger daughter's progress with rhetoric. He complained that the girl was distracted, more interested in poetry than in the logical structures of a proper speech. Cornelia listened patiently, her expression unreadable. "Poetry teaches the heart, Hermogenes," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Rhetoric teaches the mind. A Roman woman needs both." He seemed about to argue, then saw the finality in her eyes and acquiesced. Following this, she spent an hour with the estate manager, reviewing accounts from their olive groves in Etruria and the shipments of grain arriving from Egypt. Every number represented a piece of their power, a link in the long chain of commerce and influence that her ancestors had forged over centuries. This meticulous oversight was not a chore. It was a sacred duty. It was this very sense of duty that made her elder son, Lucius, so profoundly frustrating. He found her in the grand atrium, the heart of the home, where the painted walls depicted scenes from the Trojan War, and the ceiling was open to the sky. He had that earnest, troubled look on his face that he always wore after spending the morning with his Stoic philosophy tutor. She knew immediately that this would be an unpleasant conversation. He stood for a moment, his gaze drifting over the collection of Greek statues that lined the hall, masterpieces of Parian marble, purchased by her grandfather at an astonishing price. They were not mere decorations. They were the proof of their family's taste, their wealth, and their deep connection to the highest forms of culture. To Cornelia, they were as much a part of the family as Lucius himself. "Mother," he began, his tone respectful but strained, "I have been thinking about the new aqueduct proposed for the Aventine district. The state treasury is strained. The emperor encourages private citizens to contribute." Cornelia simply waited, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She knew this was merely the prelude. Lucius took a deep breath before continuing. "These statues, they are beautiful, but they are idle stone. They serve no purpose but to be looked at. The fortune they represent could bring clean water to thousands of families. It would be a gesture of true civic virtue, a practical application of the philosophies we claim to admire." He gestured to the lithe form of a marble discus thrower, its muscles frozen in perfect tension for 200 years. Think of the good it could do. For a moment, Cornelia felt a wave of disbelief so strong it left her speechless. He was not merely suggesting a donation. He was proposing they mutilate their own heritage. She saw this not as an act of charity, but as an attack on the very foundations of their identity. "These idle stones," she replied, her voice dangerously soft, "are the legacy of your great-grandfather. He did not build our family's fortune so that you could dismantle it piece by piece in the name of a fashionable philosophy. Our position in this city is not maintained by giving things away, Lucius. It is maintained by showing that we have things worth keeping." She moved closer to a statue of Aphrodite, her fingers gently tracing the cold, smooth line of the goddess's arm. Her son, however, was not so easily deterred. The new ideas had taken firm root in his mind, and he viewed the world through a different lens. But what is that position for, if not to serve the people of Rome? Father always said our family's strength comes from our service to the state, not from the things we own. It was a clever argument, turning her husband's words against her. This would be the ultimate service. The name of the Cornelii would be praised in every household that draws water from the new aqueduct. That is a legacy far more lasting than a collection of statues only our dinner guests will ever see. The challenge to her authority was clear, though veiled in the language of public good. It was a quiet battle for the soul of the next generation, unfolding right there in the silent company of gods and heroes carved from stone. Cornelia saw the chasm that had opened between them. He saw wealth as a resource to be spent, a liquid asset for grand public projects. She understood it as a complex structure of power, status, and history, where every piece had its place. To remove one was to weaken the whole. Do you think the Valeri or the Fabi families maintain their influence by selling their heirlooms? She asked, her voice sharp with impatience. They build temples. They fund games. They remind the world of their power. They do not hold a public auction of their history. The water for the Aventine will be found, Lucius. Other families will contribute, and they will gain the credit and the influence that comes with it. We will not be remembered as the family who sold their past to pay for the future.
The argument ended there, unresolved. Lucius retreated into a frustrated silence, his youthful idealism colliding with the unyielding wall of tradition she represented. She knew he did not understand. He could not see that the family's ability to fund anything at all, an aqueduct, a legion, or even his own political career, depended on the very displays of untouchable wealth he now scorned. It was a language of power that everyone in their circle understood. Selling those statues would be like a general voluntarily breaking his own sword in front of his troops. It was not a sign of generosity, but of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the world they lived in. Later that afternoon, seeking a moment of peace, Cornelia walked through the peristyle garden at the back of the villa. Here, the noise of the household was muted, replaced by the buzzing of bees among the lavender and the gentle splashing of water in the central fountain. She watched a lizard scurry across a sun-warmed stone, its tiny body a flash of green. Her son's words echoed in her thoughts, troubling her more than she cared to admit. Was he right? Was she merely the guardian of a museum, clinging to old symbols while the world changed around her? The thought was unsettling, like a faint tremor deep in the earth. She dismissed the feeling with practiced resolve. The world had always been changing. Her duty was not to change with it, but to ensure that the house of the Corneli endured through all changes, its foundation solid and its legacy intact. The statues were a part of that foundation. They were a statement, written in marble, that the family had existed for a long time and intended to exist for a great deal longer. Her son saw them as a sacrifice he was willing to make. She saw them as a symbol of the strength that made any sacrifice possible in the first place. Her mind made up, she felt a sense of calm return. The challenge from her son was not over, she knew, but she had met it with the certainty that had been passed down to her, just as the statues had been. She was the matriarch, the steadfast guardian of their fortune and their name. That was her purpose, a burden she carried not with resentment, but with a deep and abiding sense of pride. As the day began to cool and long shadows stretched across the mosaic pathways, the gentle, repeating sound of the fountain in the garden offered its familiar and comforting rhythm. Severus felt the grit of marble dust on his tongue and in the back of his throat. It was the taste of progress, a constant companion on the sprawling construction site. Around him, the sounds of creation formed a rhythmic pulse. The sharp clink of a mason's hammer striking a chisel. The grating slide of a heavy travertine block being levered into place, and the steady chorus of shouted commands in half a dozen accents. He ran a hand over a newly smoothed column, its surface cool and flawless beneath his calloused fingers.
This structure was more than stone and mortar. It was a testament, a legacy taking shape. His patron, the senator whose family name, Cornelii, was etched in the minds of Romans, had entrusted him with building these magnificent public baths. It was a project born from a philosopher's dream of civic virtue, a gift to the people of Rome. This commitment to the people was something the senator often spoke of during his visits. He would walk among the scaffolding, not with the hurried pace of a master checking on servants, but with the thoughtful steps of a man observing his own principles made solid. He spoke of clean water for all, of spaces where rich and poor could find comfort and health, a vision that made the sweat stinging Severus's eyes feel worthwhile. His men, a rough collection of laborers from Italy, Gaul, and Syria, seemed to grasp this purpose. They worked with a focused energy, knowing their efforts were raising something permanent, something far grander than the cramped apartment blocks where they slept. The work was hard, the days long, but the pay was reliable, and the sacks of grain that came with it kept their families fed. It was the old way, a bond of duty between a great family and the men who served it.
That bond began to feel brittle one afternoon during the midday break for bread and olives. The men were gathered in the shade of a half-finished wall, their conversations usually a low rumble of complaints about foremen and boasts of evening plans. But today, the talk was animated, excited. A younger worker, a bricklayer from Subura, was holding court, his eyes wide. He spoke of the games sponsored by another senator, a man named Servilius. 10 lions against a dozen spearmen from Libya, he exclaimed, gesturing wildly with a piece of bread. And that was just the morning's event. They say he's releasing a river of wine for the crowd tomorrow. The other men leaned in, their weariness forgotten, captivated by the tales of bloody spectacle and easy generosity. Severus listened quietly, a knot tightening in his gut. His patron offered Rome stone and water. Servilius offered it blood and wine. As the days passed, this talk of Servilius became more frequent, a weed growing in the cracks of his well-ordered worksite. His men seemed slower to return from their midday rest, their minds still on the roars of the crowd that could sometimes be heard from the distant amphitheater. Then the whispers turned sour. Walking through the city to purchase a new shipment of lead pipes, Severus overheard 2 merchants talking near the forum. "A fine building, those Cornelii baths," one said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the construction. "But Servilius says the family cuts corners, uses cheap lime in the mortar, and fills the walls with rubble." The other man nodded sagely. "He says they squeeze every last coin from their provincial estates to pay for it. A gift built on the backs of the exploited, he calls it." The words struck Severus like a physical blow. He knew the quality of every ounce of lime, had overseen the laying of every stone. It was a lie, a carefully crafted poison designed to spoil a good name. The poison seeped into his own crew. An older stonemason, a man Severus had worked with for a decade, approached him one morning, his hat in his hands. "The pay is fair, Severus," he began, his gaze fixed on the ground. "But Servilius is handing out silver coins just for people to attend his games.
My wife says we are fools to labor here when gold is being given away for shouting. The authority Severus had always commanded, built on fairness and shared pride in their work, now felt contested. He was being challenged not by a flaw in his leadership, but by the allure of something easier, more exciting. The steady rhythm of construction was being pitted against the frenzied thrill of the arena, and he could feel the loyalty of his men wavering with every distant cheer that drifted over the city's rooftops. This new tension was a force he did not know how to fight. He could shout and threaten, but that would only breed resentment. His patron's vision of civic good felt abstract and distant compared to the immediate, visceral appeal of a gladiatorial match. While his men were building a place for quiet cleansing, Servilius was offering a spectacle of violent release. Severus saw the contest for what it was, a battle for the heart of the people, waged not with swords, but with patronage. One offered a legacy of health and infrastructure, a gift that would last for centuries. The other offered a fleeting afternoon of excitement and a handful of coins. He found himself wondering, with a deep sense of unease, which gift the people truly wanted. A few days later, the senator visited the site again. He stood in the vast, echoing space that would become the hot bathing hall, the caldarium, and admired the scale of the vaulted ceiling. He spoke of the intricate plumbing, the science of the heating system, and the beauty of the mosaics that would one day cover the floors. He seemed oblivious to the subtle shift in the mood of the workers, to the murmurs that now followed him. Gathering his courage, Severus approached him, explaining in a low voice what he had heard in the city and among the men. He spoke of Servilius, the games, and the damaging rumors that were spreading like a fever. The senator listened intently, his brow furrowed. His gaze shifted from the soaring arches of his creation to the faces of the laborers working below. He saw not just builders, but an audience, a crowd whose favor was being courted by another. For the first time, the quiet philosopher seemed to understand that his magnificent gift did not speak for itself. Its stones were silent, its purpose noble but quiet. It could not compete with the roar of a crowd baying for blood, or the immediate gratitude of a man given a free cup of wine. The challenge was no longer about building something for the people, but about convincing them it was worth having. He placed a hand on Severus's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that settled some of the foreman's unease. Your work is honest, Severus. Its quality will outlast any lie. But his eyes were distant, already calculating a new kind of problem. A building could be designed, a workforce managed, but public opinion was as shifting and treacherous as the Tiber in a flood. He understood now that generosity was not enough. In a city like Rome, wealth and power required more than just giving. It required controlling the story, ensuring your voice was louder than the cheers for your rival. The senator left soon after, his thoughtful expression replaced by a look of grim determination. That evening, Severus walked among the towering, silent walls of the bathhouse as dusk settled. He could hear the faint sounds of music and revelry from another part of the city, where Servilius was no doubt hosting another grand feast. Here, there was only the cooling stone and the scent of damp earth. The day's contentious whispers had faded, but the grand structure now seemed less like a monument, more like a challenge. The work of building in Rome, he realized, was not finished when the last stone was laid. The day's arguments had left their mark on the men, but the great walls of the baths stood unwavering, a silent promise in the fading light. Lucius Cornelius felt the familiar weight of a gold aureus in his palm, its smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the growing unease in his gut. His chief steward, Philemon, a man whose mind was as sharp as the stylus he used, pointed to a line on the papyrus scroll spread across the polished cedar table. The numbers were clear, stark, and deeply tempting. With the plague having swept through the countryside like a phantom fire, the harvest had failed in 3 provinces. Consequently, the price of grain in Rome was climbing higher each day. The Cornelii family's warehouses along the Tiber were full, stocked from their vast estates in Egypt and Sicily. To sell now, a little at a time, would be to multiply their fortune beyond anything his ancestors had ever dreamed. Philemon spoke of this opportunity with a calm logic that grated on Cassius. The steward detailed how releasing their stores slowly would not only maximize profit, but also stabilize their holdings against the uncertainty of the times. He argued that a weakened family could not serve the state, and that true duty lay in preserving the strength of their house for the future. Cassius listened, his gaze drifting past the steward to the open courtyard, where the water in the central fountain seemed to splash with a hollow, lonely sound. The usual chorus of birds was muted, and the normal bustle of household slaves moving through the colonnades had been replaced by a quiet, deliberate caution. Everyone moved as if they were trying not to disturb a sleeping beast. Leaving the steward to his scrolls, Cassius walked out into the city, his fine leather sandals slapping against the hot flagstones. He needed to see it for himself, to feel the city's pulse. He descended from the clean, orderly heights of the Palatine Hill, where the grand houses stood in silent tribute to generations of power. The further he went, the more the character of the city changed. He moved through the Forum, which was less crowded than usual. Senators and merchants still gathered in small knots, their voices low and urgent, but the vibrant energy was gone. He saw a group of men gathered around a public notice board, their faces tight with worry as they read the latest official grain prices. A shiver, unrelated to the day's warmth, traced its way down his spine. This unease grew as he entered the winding, narrow streets of the Subura, the city's crowded heart. Here, the silence of the Palatine was replaced by a different kind of quiet, a tense, waiting stillness. People leaned in doorways, their eyes following him with a mixture of deference and something that looked like desperate hope. The smell of wood smoke was thin, and the usual comforting aroma of baking bread was absent. Instead, a sour scent of sweat and sickness clung to the shaded alleys. He saw a woman carefully washing a handful of wilted greens in the runoff from a fountain, her movements slow and methodical, as if each leaf were a treasure. He had always known poverty existed, but he had seen it as a distant, abstract feature of the city, like the aqueducts or the temples. Now it had a face. He passed a line of people waiting outside a baker's shop, a line that did not move. There was no bread to sell, only the hope that a shipment might arrive. A small child, no older than his own son, sat on the steps, her face smudged with dirt, and her expression empty. She was not crying, she seemed beyond that. This single image struck him with more force than all of Philemon's ledgers. The child's quiet suffering made the columns of potential profits seem obscene, a monument to greed built upon a foundation of silent despair. He felt the weight of his grandfather's words, teachings he had studied more as a philosophical exercise than as a guide for living. A man is a citizen first, his grandfather had written on a scroll Cassius knew by heart, and his fortune is not his own, but a loan from the gods, to be used in service to the Republic. Returning to his villa was like entering another world. The cool marble under his feet felt like an accusation. The vibrant frescoes depicting mythological feasts seemed to mock the hunger he had just witnessed. He walked past statues of his ancestors, consuls, generals, men who had built this fortune. Their stone eyes seemed to watch him, to judge him. Had they faced such a choice? He wondered if the general who conquered a foreign land ever thought about the farmers whose fields fed his legions, or if the senator who passed a law ever saw the faces of the people it would affect. He felt a sudden bitter connection to them, not in their triumphs, but in the crushing burden of a decision that held the well-being of thousands in its balance. He found himself in his private study, the room his grandfather had favored. He ran his hand over the smooth, worn wood of the reading desk, a silent communion with the man who had taught him about duty. Outside, the city was a living thing, gasping for breath. Inside his warehouses, thousands of tons of grain sat in silent, golden heaps, a potential poison or a potential cure. Philemon's logic was the logic of commerce, the cold arithmetic of survival. It was practical, it was sensible. Selling the grain for a fortune would secure his family for a century. It would allow them to fund armies, build temples, and continue the family's legacy of patronage and power. But his grandfather's logic was the logic of the Stoa, the philosophy that taught self-control, fortitude, and the duty of man to his community. It was a philosophy that measured wealth not in coin, but in honor. To exploit the city's suffering would be to poison his own soul, to betray the very principles of Roman virtue his family claimed to embody. He saw two paths laid out before him with terrible clarity. One was paved with gold and led to a future of immense power, but it ran through streets filled with gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts. The other path was one of immense sacrifice, a trail that would diminish his fortune and perhaps his family's influence, but it led to a city that might yet survive. He imagined the faces in the Subura again, especially the small girl on the steps. He thought of the quiet desperation in their eyes. For them, this was not a philosophical problem. It was a question of whether they would eat tomorrow. The sheer scale of their need dwarfed his own concerns about legacy and influence. What was the point of a powerful family in a city of the dead? What honor was there in being the richest man in a graveyard? The teachings he had once read as abstract ideals now felt like direct commands, echoing not from a dusty scroll, but from the heart of the suffering city itself. The internal debate, which had raged within him like a fever, finally subsided. A strange calm settled over him, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. He felt the weight of his decision, but it was no longer a crushing burden. Instead, it felt solid, real, like the foundation stone of a great building. He knew what he had to do. The choice was not between profit and philanthropy. It was between being the kind of man his steward advised him to be and the kind of man his grandfather had taught him to be. It was a choice about the soul of his family, not just its finances. He called for Philemon. When the steward entered the study, his face was arranged in an expression of patient expectation, ready to present more figures, more projections. But he stopped when he saw his master's face. Cassius did not need to consult the scrolls again. He gave his orders in a clear, steady voice. The warehouses were to be opened. The grain was to be sold, not at the extortionate market price, but at the price it had been before the plague began. It was an act that would cost them a fortune, an act that many of his peers would call madness. But as he spoke the words, he felt as if a great weight had been lifted. With the coming evening, Cassius found a quiet sense of purpose in the difficult path he had chosen for his family. In the quiet of the master's study, a room known as the tabulinum, Bassa's world was reduced to columns of numbers scratched into wax. As the chief administrator of the Corneli household, he was a slave who commanded other slaves, a man who owned nothing but controlled a fortune. His stylus, the pointed tool for writing, moved with a familiar rhythm, checking figures from the family's estates in Egypt and Africa. He did not need the harsh sunlight to know the hour. The deep silence of the villa told him everything. Before the sickness, this time of day would have been filled with the sounds of couriers arriving and petitioners waiting. Now, the quiet felt like a coiled serpent, and every distant cough from the city streets made the muscles in his back tighten. He ran a finger over a tablet detailing the grain stores, the numbers representing a mountain of wealth that grew larger with every passing day of the city's hunger. This knowledge was the source of his current dread. His master, Cassius, had returned from the forum the day before with a new pallor to his skin, one that had nothing to do with the plague. Bassa had seen that look before, in Cassius's grandfather, a man who spoke often of a philosopher's duty to the state. Cassius had inherited not just the family's wealth, but also that burdensome conscience. Bassa knew, with a certainty that left a cold stone in his gut, that his master was wrestling with the grain. The city starved, while the Corneli warehouses overflowed. For Cassius, this was a question of virtue. For Bassa, it was a question of survival. He had served this family his entire life, and his position of authority, his relative comforts, and the safety of his own wife and children were all threads woven into the grand tapestry of the Corneli fortune. If his master chose virtue over profit, that tapestry could unravel with breathtaking speed. His own small family lived in comfortable quarters behind the main villa. His son, born here in the house, was learning to read from a tutor who taught the master's children. His wife managed the household linens, a position of trust. They were privileged, protected, and utterly dependent. This fragile peace depended entirely on the family's continued prosperity. Bassa had heard stories his whole life, whispered among the staff, of great households that had fallen on hard times. He knew what happened next. The downsizing, as it was clinically called, meant an auction in the slave market. Families were torn apart. Skilled administrators like himself sold to harsher masters, and children sent to work in mines or fields. The thought made his hand pause over the wax tablet, the sharp point of the stylus digging a meaningless gouge into its surface. Gratitude was a heavy cloak, one he had worn willingly for years. Cassius was a fair master, never cruel, and Bassa's loyalty to him was genuine. But self-preservation was a deeper, more primal instinct. He found himself torn between the duty he owed his master and the fierce protective duty he owed his own children. He could not speak to Cassius directly, for a slave did not offer advice on such matters. To do so would be an unforgivable presumption. His influence had to be more subtle, a gentle pressure applied through the one thing he controlled completely, the flow of information. He could not tell his master what to think, but he could shape the facts upon which his master's thoughts were built. This realization brought with it a profound sense of shame, a feeling like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. With this grim purpose settling over him, he began his work. It was his task to prepare the weekly summary of household expenditures for the master's review. He pulled a fresh tablet toward him, its dark wax surface smooth and ready. He did not need to invent figures. The truth was malleable enough for his purposes. He started with the list of repairs for the family's many apartment blocks in the city's poorer districts. The costs were always high, with leaking roofs and crumbling plaster a constant drain on resources. He chose to list every single minor expense, rather than grouping them as he usually did. The long column of figures looked more intimidating, more substantial, than a single summarized total. It was not a lie, merely a change in presentation. Next, he turned to the reports from the family's country villa. The overseer had requested funds to replace a section of the aqueduct that supplied the baths. It was a necessary expense, but not an urgent one. Bassa moved it from the list of future projects to the list of immediate needs. He added a note about the risk of further damage if the work was delayed, using the overseer's most pessimistic language. Then came the costs of the household itself, the recent shipment of expensive wine from Gaul, the inflated price of olive oil due to the plague's disruption of trade, the cost of the extra guards Cassius had hired to protect the city villa from desperate mobs. Each expense was legitimate, but when laid out one after another, they painted a picture of a household stretched thin, its finances far more precarious than they actually were. He worked for hours, the only sound the soft scratch of his stylus. Each number he wrote felt like a small betrayal, a stain on the loyalty he had always prided himself on. He was using his skill, the very intelligence that had earned him his master's trust, to deceive him. He was steering Cassius toward a decision of pure self-interest, the very choice his master's philosophical training taught him to disdain. Bassa hoped his master would see the numbers and conclude that the family could not afford a grand gesture of philanthropy. He hoped Cassius would choose to protect his inheritance, and in doing so, protect the small world Bassa had built for his family within its walls. The shame of his actions was a bitter taste in his mouth, but the fear for his children's future was sharper still. When the tablets were ready, he carried them into the peristyle, the open courtyard garden where Cassius often sat. His master was there, staring blankly at the fountain whose splashing water suddenly seemed loud in the oppressive silence. Bassa approached, his footsteps quiet on the mosaic tiles. He presented the accounts without a word, his eyes fixed on the floor. He felt his master's gaze on him, and for a terrifying moment, he thought his deception was plain to see, that his shame was written across his face. He forced himself to remain still, to breathe slowly, to play the part of the faithful servant delivering a routine report. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the slow, steady beat of the water falling in the fountain.
Slow pace. Cassius took the tablets, his fingers brushing against Bassa's. The master's hands were cool. He scanned the columns of figures, his brow furrowing slightly. Bassa watched his master's expression, searching for any sign of suspicion, for any question that might undo his careful work. But Cassius only sighed, a deep, weary sound of a man burdened by too many responsibilities. He nodded, a gesture of dismissal, and turned his attention back to the water. "Thank you, Bassa," he said, his voice flat. "That will be all." Relief washed over Bassa so intensely that his knees felt weak as he backed away. He had done it. He had planted the seeds of doubt, a barrier of carefully constructed costs against an impulse of generosity. Retreating to the shadows of the colonnade, Bassa watched his master for a moment longer. The fate of hundreds of hungry people, the financial future of one of Rome's great families, and the simple, desperate hope of a single slave all rested on the calculations now taking place in one man's mind. Bassa had tipped the scales, nudging his master away from conscience and toward coin. He felt no triumph, only the hollow ache of his own quiet treachery. The silent, ordered world of the household that surrounded him felt both a fragile shelter and a gilded cage, and he knew he would do anything to keep its bars from breaking. The old mosaic floors, once warmed by the elaborate underfloor heating systems his ancestors had prized, were now perpetually cold under Flavius Cornelius's feet. The furnaces had long been extinguished, their fuel now too precious to waste on simple comfort. Instead, the great central hall of the Etrurian villa was warmed by a large open fire pit dug directly into the floor, its smoke blackening the painted ceilings that depicted myths of long-forgotten gods. Flavius pulled his heavy wool cloak tighter around his shoulders, his breath misting in the cavernous space. His wealth was no longer counted in the stacks of coins that sat uselessly in locked chests, their silver content so diluted by the emperor's desperate measures that merchants in the nearest town now laughed at them. True wealth was the height of the new stone walls surrounding the estate, the number of loyal men who would fight for him,
and the precise depth of the grain in the sealed granaries. This new reality meant his days were spent not in quiet study or political correspondence, but in practical, unending vigilance. He walked the perimeter of the new fortifications twice a day, his boots crunching on the gravel path his men had laid. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn stone, a stark contrast to the smooth, polished marble of the villa's original construction. Where elegant statues of nymphs once stood in gardens, sharpened wooden stakes now pointed outward from earthen ramparts. His household guard, men paid in food, wine, and a small plot of land, watched the horizon from hastily built wooden towers. They were not legionaries, but they were determined, their families living in the converted servants' quarters and storehouses within the compound. They knew, as he did, that the protection of the state was a story told to children. Safety was now a private enterprise. Because of this constant threat, the arrival of anyone on the main road was cause for immediate alarm. The sound of the horn from the western watchtower sent a ripple of tension through the compound. Men grabbed their spears and moved toward the gate, their expressions grim. Flavius climbed the main gatehouse, his heart pounding a steady, familiar rhythm of apprehension. Below, a group of people, perhaps 30 in all, huddled on the road. They were not soldiers or bandits, not by the looks of them. Their clothes were rags, their bodies were thin, and they carried nothing but the children who were too weak to walk. They looked up at the stone walls of the villa, not with aggression, but with a desperate, hollowed-out hope that was somehow more unnerving than any threat. An older man, who seemed to be their leader, stepped forward, his hands held open to show he was unarmed. His voice, carried on the crisp autumn wind, was raspy with thirst and exhaustion. He begged for shelter and for food, not for charity, he claimed, but in exchange for work. He spoke of their village being burned by a band of deserters from a forgotten northern campaign, a story Flavius had heard a dozen times before with slight variations. He listened, his face an unreadable mask, while his chief retainer, a tough old veteran named Geta, muttered beside him. Geta pointed out the obvious. Their own stores were carefully measured to last through the winter, and feeding 30 extra mouths would be a catastrophic drain. "Generosity is a luxury, master," Geta whispered, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "A luxury for a different time." Flavius felt trapped between two impossible worlds. One was the world of his ancestors, the world of the Cornelii, who had built their name on civic duty and the responsibilities of patronage. His great-grandfather Cassius had emptied his granaries to feed Rome during a plague. Such an act was remembered in family histories as the highest virtue. Yet that Rome, a city of order and abundance, no longer existed beyond the pages of old books. The other world was the one that existed now, right outside his gate. It was a world of sharp edges, empty bellies, and brutal arithmetic. In this world, every sack of grain given away was a sack his own people might need when the snows came, or when the next band of raiders appeared at their walls. He looked down at the faces of the refugees, seeing the dirt-streaked cheeks of children who reminded him of his own son, sleeping safely within the villa. Then he looked at the hard, expectant faces of his own guards lining the wall. Their loyalty was not to an abstract ideal of Roman charity, but to him, the man who guaranteed their food and their safety. He knew that if he showed weakness, if he jeopardized their survival for the sake of strangers, that loyalty would fray. The trust that held their small, fragile world together was more valuable than any amount of grain. His body felt heavy, each breath a conscious effort, as he weighed the ghosts of the past against the demands of the present. His decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to the cold logic of the age. He ordered Geta to give them 2 sacks of barley and a side of cured pork. It was enough to last them a few days on the road, a gesture that was more than nothing, but far less than they needed. He would not, however, open the gates. He watched the refugees take the food, their gratitude mixed with the clear, painful understanding of their rejection. They did not argue or curse him. They simply took the small offering, gathered their people, and continued their slow, shuffling journey down the road, heading toward a destination they themselves likely did not know. Flavius remained on the wall, watching until they were just small specks in the distance. The solid iron-banded gate ground shut below him, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding home echoing across the courtyard. It was the sound of safety, the sound of survival, but it brought him no comfort. He had done what was necessary. He had protected his own. He wondered if his great-grandfather would have called him a pragmatist or a coward. The distinction seemed to have vanished along with the empire. In the growing darkness, Flavius carried the cold weight of the day's decision down from the wall and into the flickering firelight of the great hall. He knew this was just the first of many such choices he would have to make, each one chipping away at the man his ancestors had believed a Cornelius ought to be, forging instead the man who was needed to survive the world that was. The wind howled outside the fortified walls, a lonely sound that promised a long and difficult winter ahead. The cold morning mist clung to Aemilianus's tunic, a damp weight that settled deep in his bones. Every muscle in his back and shoulders protested as he guided the old ox. Its slow, plodding steps, a rhythm he had known since he was a boy. He was a colonus, a tenant farmer, a word that meant he belonged to this plot of land as much as the olive trees or the stubborn rocks. His father had told him that his own grandfather had been free to leave, to seek work in a town if the harvest was poor. For Aemilianus, such a choice was an impossible dream. An imperial decree, decades old, had bound his family to this soil forever. Therefore, he did not look to the horizon with hope, but only to the furrow turning over before him, the dark, rich earth, a promise of both sustenance and servitude.
This sense of being fixed in place was reinforced when the estate overseer arrived, not on foot as the old patrons were said to have done, but on a stout horse that trampled the edge of the tilled field. The overseer, a man named Crixus, did not speak of the weather or the health of the ox. He spoke only of shares. Because of the troubles on the frontier, the master in Ravenna, a distant Cornelii whose face Aemilianus had never seen, required more grain to pay for the soldiers who guarded the villa.
The demand was not a negotiation, it was a pronouncement. Aemilianus nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the ground. Arguing was pointless. Crixus represented a power as unchangeable as the seasons, a system that no longer offered protection, only demanded payment for it. Consequently, Aemilianus and his family worked with a quiet desperation, their movements sharpened by anxiety. Every stalk of wheat was gathered, every fallen olive collected. They were not just harvesting for themselves, but for two masters, the owner of the land and another, more fearsome one. That second master arrived a month later when the grain was threshed and stored in the small barn. They came not as a single man on horseback, but as a group of four. An imperial tax official with his wax tablet and stylus, and 3 soldiers whose leather armor creaked with every step. They did not ask. They simply unsealed the barn door and began their calculations, their voices loud and confident in the quiet farmyard. The official, a man with a perpetually sour expression, made marks on his tablet, while the soldiers stood with their spears held loosely, a casual display of the force that underpinned the entire transaction. Aemilianus stood beside his wife, Lyra, their children huddled behind them. He could feel his heart thudding against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He watched the official point to the sacks of wheat, then to the jars of oil, his calculations reducing a year of back-breaking labor into a few cold numbers on a tablet. This process was entirely impersonal. There was no room for discussion of blight or a dry spring or the needs of a growing family. The empire's hunger was absolute and had to be fed first. After the official announced the amount owed, Aemilianus and his eldest son, Marcus, began hauling the heavy sacks from the barn to the waiting cart. Each sack felt heavier than the last, a physical representation of the food being taken from his children's mouths for the coming winter. He offered them the portion they demanded without a word of protest, his face a mask of compliance. He knew they were looking for any sign of resistance, any hint that there might be more than what was declared. Instead, he played the part of a beaten man, his shoulders slumped, his movements slow and weary. It was a performance for survival, one he had perfected over many seasons of loss. As the tax cart rumbled away, leaving a trail of dust on the path, a profound silence fell over the small family. They did not celebrate what was left, for it was barely enough to see them through to the next planting. The old stories of patrons giving gifts of wine at harvest time or ensuring their tenants had enough to survive a harsh winter seemed like tales from another world. The great family whose name was carved into the crumbling stone arch at the villa entrance was no longer a presence in their lives. It was simply a name attached to a relentless demand, a force that extracted wealth but offered nothing in return. That night, long after the moon had risen, the true work began. While the younger children slept, Aemilianus, Lyra, and Marcus moved with practiced quiet. They lifted several large flagstones from the floor of their one-room hut, revealing a deep, dry pit lined with clay. From a thicket of overgrown bushes behind their home, they retrieved the other sacks of grain, the real surplus, the portion they had harvested in secret before the official threshing. The air inside the hut grew warm from their effort, and the scent of grain dust was sharp in their nostrils. Every rustle of the sacks, every scrape of stone, sounded as loud as a thunderclap in the stillness.
The process involved a silent, desperate choreography. Marcus would pass a sack down into the pit, and Aemilianus would carefully arrange it to maximize the space, ensuring no moisture from the earth could touch it. Lyra stood watch at the doorway, her silhouette a dark shape against the pale moonlight, listening for the sound of a passing patrol or a curious neighbor. This was their true harvest, the one born not of labor alone, but of cunning and shared risk. Loyalty to the estate was a fool's bargain. Loyalty to each other was the only thing that kept them from starving. Their entire existence depended on this deception, a quiet rebellion measured in hidden bushels of wheat. Once the last sack was hidden and the stones were carefully replaced, with dirt brushed into the cracks to hide the seams, they sat together in the dim light of a single oil lamp. They shared a piece of coarse bread, the taste of it both a comfort and a reminder of how little they had. Aemilianus looked at his son's face, already lined with the worry of a grown man, and at his wife's hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of work. He wondered if this was all their lives would ever be, a constant struggle to hide a little bit of what they earned from those who held all the power. The grand villa on the hill, with its fading mosaics and statues, might as well have been on the moon for all it mattered to their daily survival. He thought of the name Cornelii, a name that had once built temples and baths in Rome, a name that had commanded legions. To him, it was just the brand on the neck of his ox, a symbol of ownership. The intricate web of obligation and respect his father had spoken of had frayed and snapped, leaving only a harsh chain of command. His duty was not to a patron or an emperor, but to the hollow space beneath his floor and the precious grain it protected. His world had shrunk to the size of this small hut and the secret it held. Finally, Lyra banked the embers of the small fire, plunging the room into near darkness. Aemilianus lay down on his straw mattress, but sleep did not come easily. He could feel the hardness of the floorboards, and beneath them the presence of their hidden food. That grain was their future, their defiance, their hope. As he listened to the sound of his family's steady breathing, Aemilianus went over the numbers in his head one last time. The morning would arrive with its familiar aches and unending work. The cool air inside the new basilica felt like a balm on Cornelia's skin after she had walked through the city's crowded lanes. Here, the noise of wheels on stone and the calls of merchants faded, replaced by the hushed echo of her own footsteps on the marble floor. Light, filtered through high, clear glass windows, illuminated not painted gods feasting and fighting,
but simple, powerful symbols carved into the walls: the fish, the anchor, and the shepherd with his lamb. She knelt on the hard stone, the discomfort a small price for the profound sense of peace that settled over her. This was a place of quiet strength, a world away from the gilded, fading glories her family had always treasured. It felt clean, purposeful, and above all, new. Rising, she saw Bishop Ambrosius waiting near the altar, his robes simple, but his presence commanding. He was a man who understood power not just in the next world, but in this one. His influence reached the emperor's court, yet he spoke to the city's poorest beggars as if they were his own kin. They discussed her proposal, his sharp eyes missing nothing as he reviewed the figures she had prepared. A xenodochium, he murmured, the Greek word for a charitable guest house, a place for the sick and the traveler, built in the name of God. It would be a testament to your faith, Cornelia. His encouragement solidified her resolve. This was more than charity. It was a redirection of history, a way to turn the dead weight of her family's gold into living works of mercy. Leaving the bishop's presence, Cornelia returned to the family's grand house on the hill, a journey that felt like traveling backward in time. The gates, once proudly displaying the image of an eagle, now bore a small, hastily carved chi rho, the intertwined Greek letters for Christ's name, a mark of the new faith placed over the old. Inside, the atrium was vast and shadowed, the air still and carrying the faint, dusty scent of things left undisturbed for too long. Her brother Lucius was waiting for her in the study, surrounded by scrolls and wax tablets that charted the family's wealth back through the generations. He did not rise, merely gesturing to a chair, his face set in the stern lines of a man preparing for a familiar battle. Lucius listened to her plan with a contrived patience that soon wore thin. When she finished, he unrolled a brittle papyrus scroll, its edges crumbling. "This," he said, his voice low and tight, "is the record of the endowment our ancestor, the first consul in our line, made to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. For 400 years, every generation of our family has honored it. They have repaired the roof, replaced the sacred vessels, and funded the sacrifices." He looked up, his eyes filled with a frustration she knew well. "You would take the money meant to honor the gods who gave us everything and give it to a Galilean carpenter worshipped in a glorified barn?" He scoffed. "They build simple halls for their god, and you want to give them our marble?" The argument that followed was as old as the growing division in the city itself. Cornelia spoke of a new covenant, of storing treasures in heaven rather than in vaults on earth. She described the faces of the sick she had seen in the city's poorest quarters, their needs immediate and immense. "Our legacy cannot be preserving stone, Lucius," she pleaded. "It must be in serving the living." He countered with duty, tradition, and the weight of their name. "Our name is stone," he retorted, striking the heavy oak table. "It is carved on the foundations of that temple. To let it crumble is to let our own history be forgotten. What will the other old families think? The Fabii and the Valerii are all watching. They are restoring their family shrines." This disagreement was no longer confined to the villa's walls. It had spilled out into the community. The town was a patchwork of loyalties. Lucius found his support in the quiet gardens of other aristocratic houses, where men gathered to read the old poets and lament the decline of traditional virtues. They saw the Christian bishops as usurpers, growing rich and powerful while the great temples decayed. They promised Lucius their political support, their voices carrying weight in the city senate, which, though largely powerless, still held the echoes of ancient authority. Their world was one of memory and obligation to the past, a world Cornelia felt was sinking like a waterlogged ship. Meanwhile, Cornelia found her allies not in echoing halls, but in crowded tenements and bustling markets. She walked with the deacons of the church as they distributed bread, her fine linen tunic seeming out of place against the rough wool of the poor. Yet the people did not resent her wealth. They saw it as a potential instrument of God's grace. They looked to the church for everything, for food in times of famine, for justice when the magistrates were corrupt, and for hope in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. They were a community bound not by ancestry, but by a shared, fervent belief in a better world to come, and their numbers grew with every passing month. The source of their conflict, a block of shops and apartments near the grain market, produced a steady river of silver each year. For generations, that income had been divided, some for the family's expenses, the rest set aside for civic duties, which had always included the temple's upkeep. As co-heirs, both Cornelius's and Lucius's consent was required to redirect such a large sum. The family's chief steward, an old freedman who had served their father, tried to keep peace between them, a task he found increasingly impossible. He would present the accounts to Lucius with a formal bow, then later cross the atrium and make the sign of the cross before entering Cornelius' chambers, hedging his bets on which power, old or new, would ultimately prevail. Lucius made one last appeal, not to her faith, but to her blood. He led her to the gallery of ancestors, where the marble busts of their forebears stared down with blank, stern eyes. These men built a world, he said, his hand resting on the shoulder of a bearded general who had fought for the Republic. They understood that power required display. They knew that a family's strength was shown in the grandeur of its public gifts. This hospital of yours is a fine idea, but it is a gesture of weakness. It says we are no longer strong enough to maintain the symbols of our history. It is an admission of defeat. Cornelia looked at the cold, proud faces and felt not a connection, but a great distance. They were men of a different world, a world she had been taught to renounce. She thought of the perfect, emotionless beauty of a statue of Venus in the corner of the gallery, a piece her father had cherished. She could still admire its form, the impossible grace of its lines, but it stirred nothing in her soul. It was a beautiful shell, empty of truth. They built a world that is dying, Lucius, she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. Their world is one of conquest and glory. My world must be one of compassion and salvation. We cannot serve both. Her decision was made. She would not, could not yield. Returning to her chambers, she drafted a letter to Bishop Ambrosius, informing him that she would proceed. She would petition the courts to have the inheritance formally divided. With the bishop's backing and the favor of the Christian emperor's officials, she knew the law would likely side with her. It would be a messy, public affair that would shatter what was left of their family's unity, a final, irrevocable break. She signed the letter, the scratch of the reed pen the only sound in the room. A profound sadness settled over her, the grief of severing ties with her own past.
Lucius saw the messenger leave with the sealed letter and knew what it meant. He confronted her one last time in the atrium, not with anger, but with a cold, quiet sorrow. "You have chosen," he said, his voice hollow. "You have chosen their future over our past." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone beneath the fading fresco of Aeneas carrying his father from the ruins of Troy. For a moment she saw the scene through her brother's eyes, a son honoring his father, carrying the legacy of his ancestors from the ashes. But then her own faith reasserted itself, and she saw it differently. A man fleeing a doomed city to build a new one. From her window, the faint sounds from the Christian quarter of the city reached her, the steady cadence of evening chants beginning their rise. It was a new pulse for a city whose ancient heart was slowly falling silent, and she knew she had chosen to beat in time with it, no matter the cost. Paulus, prefect of the city's grain supply, pulled his woolen cloak tighter around his shoulders, though the afternoon was not cold. He stood on the steps of the Basilica Ulpia, watching a crowd gather near the Horea, the great warehouses that lined the riverbank. There was a low murmur rising from them, a sound like distant hornets that he had learned to dread. It was the sound of hunger turning to anger. For weeks, the grain shipments from Africa had been sporadic, and the public stores were nearly empty. The faces in the crowd were thin, their eyes filled with a desperate patience that was quickly wearing away. He knew that if a solution was not found, that murmur would become a roar, and the roar would be followed by the crash of splintering doors and the spilling of blood on the cobblestones. His duty was clear, even if the path to fulfilling it was not. Following the customs of his ancestors, his first and most proper course of action was to appeal to the great families. For centuries, when the state faltered, it was the private wealth of the senatorial class that filled the gap, their patronage a pillar of the city's stability. Paulus began his grim pilgrimage up the Palatine Hill, past once grand homes whose mosaics were now cracked and whose gardens were overgrown with weeds. He sought out the domus of the Cornelii, a family whose name was etched into the very stones of Rome, on temples and bathhouses built in a time of unimaginable plenty. The current head of the family, an elderly man named Romulus, received him not in a grand hall, but in a small, chilly study. The old man's hands trembled as he explained, his voice a dry whisper, that the family's estates in Etruria were barely producing enough for themselves, and their African holdings had been lost to the Vandals years ago.
He offered Paulus a cup of watered wine and a plate of memories, speaking of a grandfather who fed the city for a month from his private stores. The words were a bitter dust in Paulus's mouth. Leaving the Palatine, Paulus felt a hollowness in his chest that mirrored the empty warehouses. He walked through the forum, where gilded statues had been stripped from their pedestals long ago, melted down to pay for soldiers who had since deserted. The paving stones were uneven, and a foul dampness rose from a clogged drain near the Curia, the old Senate house, which now stood silent and mostly empty. Hundreds of togas had once gathered there. Now, a few dozen men met to argue over problems they had no power to solve. This was the inheritance of his generation, a city of magnificent ghosts. The traditional solution, the appeal to Roman solidarity and the generosity of the great families, had failed. It was not a lack of will that stopped them, but a simple, brutal lack of means. The wealth that had built this world was gone, a river dried to a trickle.
This left only one other option, a choice that felt like a betrayal of everything his family had stood for. For generations, the men of his line had served the Senate and the Roman people. Now, to save those people, he would have to humble himself before a man who was Roman in name only. He made his way to the Castra Praetoria, the old barracks of the Praetorian Guard. The guards were long gone, replaced by the towering, bearded warriors of the Goth general who now commanded the city's garrison. Unlike the decaying villas of the Palatine, this place was alive with a harsh, disciplined energy. Men with fair hair and strange tattoos on their arms sharpened swords, their movements efficient and sure. The sounds were different here, too. The sharp commands given in a guttural language, the rough laughter so unlike the carefully modulated tones of the Roman elite. The general, whose name was Valdemar, received Paulus in a room that had once been a shrine to the emperor. The marble bust had been moved to a corner, and in its place stood a simple wooden table covered in maps and weapon schematics. Valdemar was a large man, his scarred hands resting on the hilt of a long sword that never seemed to leave his side. He listened to Paulus's careful, formal plea without interruption. He did not speak of tradition or civic duty. When Paulus finished, the Goth gestured to a corner of the room, where heavy sacks were neatly stacked to the ceiling. It was grain, more than Paulus had seen in one place in a year, captured from a rebel convoy in the north. Valdemar possessed what the senators did not: soldiers who could take what was needed and the resources to distribute it. The Goth's offer was direct. He would release the grain to the city. His soldiers would oversee the distribution to prevent riots. He asked for no money, for he knew the city treasury was empty. Instead, he wanted something more valuable. He demanded a public proclamation to be read in the forum, thanking him and his men for their generous gift to the people of Rome. It was a simple request on the surface, but Paulus understood its true weight. It would be a formal acknowledgement that the security of Rome, its very survival, no longer rested in the hands of its traditional magistrates or senators. Power would be seen to reside where it truly was, with the man who commanded the strongest troops
and held the keys to the granaries. Paulus found himself caught between two impossibilities. He could uphold Roman tradition, make a futile and final appeal to the bankrupt aristocrats, and watch his city starve and burn. In this, he would preserve the hollow shell of Roman authority until the very end. Or he could swallow his pride, accept the help of the barbarian commander, and feed the people. This path would ensure their survival, but at the cost of publicly admitting that the old ways were finished. He thought of the pinched faces of the children he had seen in the market, their silent hunger a reproach to the grand, empty gestures of men like Lucius Cornelius. What was the value of tradition if it led only to ruin? What was the purpose of pride in a city of the dead? He stood before the Goth general, the scent of leather and oiled steel a sharp contrast to the faint perfume and decay of the Palatine villa. The choice was not merely between two men, but between two worlds. One was the world of his ancestors, a world of laws and letters and ancient families, now crumbling into dust. The other was a new world, one of cold iron and practical strength, embodied by the man who sat before him. Part of him recoiled from the shame of it, the humiliation of begging a foreigner to do what Romans could no longer do for themselves. Yet the memory of the hungry crowd compelled him forward. He had a duty not to a memory, but to the living. "The people of Rome will be grateful for your generosity, General," Paulus said, his own voice sounding distant and strange in his ears. "I will have the proclamation drawn up immediately." With those words, he felt something shift, not just in the room, but in the foundations of the world he knew. He had secured bread for the city, but in doing so, he had acknowledged a new master. He was no longer just an official of Rome, he was now a supplicant, negotiating the survival of his community with a foreign power that occupied its heart. As he walked away from the barracks, he did not look back. He focused instead on the path ahead, on the practical steps of organizing the distribution and drafting the humiliating proclamation. He felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sense of resignation. He had made the only choice he could, the only choice that placed the lives of his people above the pride of their rulers. The traditional bonds of community, the solidarity of Roman to Roman, had proven too weak to hold. A new, harder bond, one of necessity and military might, was taking its place. The harsh cadence of the Goth's foreign speech followed him from the camp, a sound that lingered as he considered the bitter price of survival. The silence in the grand dining hall was the most unnerving part. Romulus Cornelius, last of his line in the city, remembered a time when this room echoed with laughter, the scrape of chairs, and the quiet commands to servants. Now, the only sound was the whisper of his own tunic against the cool marble floor, and the distant, mournful cry of a peacock from the overgrown gardens. The frescoes on the walls depicting triumphant ancestors were faded and peeling in the damp, a testament to a glory that felt as distant as the founding of Rome itself. He ran a hand over the cold, heavy lid of a wooden chest, one of a dozen that lined the walls. These chests held the family's final, true treasure, not land that could be seized or coin that had lost its worth, but something more substantial: centuries of silver plate. This collection was the physical record of his family's journey. It contained heavy platters gifted by an emperor generations ago, wine cups engraved with the victories of a consul, and delicate spoons crafted for a wedding that took place when the city felt eternal. Each piece was a story, a connection to a past that seemed more real than the unsettling present. Outside the villa's walls, the city itself was a ghost. The title of emperor was now an empty word, spoken only in jest or sorrow. A chieftain from the north, Afer, a man whose people his ancestors would have called barbarians, now gave the orders. He did not rule from the Palatine Palace, but from a fortified camp, and his authority came not from a senate, but from the long spears of his loyal warriors. Because of this, the old ways of influence had vanished, replaced by a simple and brutal calculation of strength.
That calculation had arrived at his door the night before, carried by two men whose faces were etched with the desperate hope of a lost cause. Senator Petronius, a man so old his toga seemed to hold him upright, and Valerius, whose hands still trembled with a fire his weary eyes could not match, had spoken in hushed, urgent tones. They spoke of honor, of Roman pride, of one last stand. "The silver, Romulus," Petronius had rasped, his voice thin as papyrus. "It is the only real wealth left among us. Melt it down. With it, we can buy the loyalty of 1,000 men, enough to challenge this German upstart and restore a true Roman to power." The plan was madness, a fleeting dream of defiance against an overwhelming reality. Yet their appeal to his ancestry, to the legacy contained in those chests, struck a painful chord within him. Their visit left a bitter taste in his mouth, the flavor of despair. The senators saw the silver as a weapon, a final, defiant gesture. To Romulus, the thought of the intricate engravings of his family's history melting into nameless, shapeless bars of metal was a physical violation. It felt like burning a library to provide a moment's warmth. Moreover, he knew it would be for nothing. Odoacer's army was seasoned and loyal. A hastily purchased group of mercenaries would scatter at the first sign of real conflict. Joining their futile plot was not an act of honor, but a form of suicide, one that would erase the last tangible evidence that the Cornelii had ever mattered at all. Just as the memory of that desperate meeting began to fade, a different kind of visitor had arrived that morning. These men were not furtive shadows in the night, but an official delegation, their approach announced by the firm knock of a soldier's spear butt on his gate. They were Odoacer's envoys, a Goth with a braided beard who looked profoundly uncomfortable in his Roman-style tunic, and a Roman administrator, a man whose face was a smooth mask of polite neutrality. They did not ask for the silver. They offered him an opportunity. The great chieftain Odoacer, they explained, was consolidating his rule and wished to show his respect for the ancient families of Rome. A gift, they suggested, would be a powerful symbol of cooperation. A contribution of his famous silver collection to the new ruler's treasury
would be seen as a sign of friendship, securing the Cornelii family's place in the new order of things. The request was a threat wrapped in the language of diplomacy, and Romulus understood it perfectly. The difference between a gift and tribute was merely a matter of wording. By contrast to the senator's wild scheme, this path offered survival. It meant keeping the villa, retaining a sliver of status, and living to see another season. But the cost was immense. To hand over the legacy of his ancestors to a barbarian chieftain felt like the ultimate surrender, an admission that everything they had built, all the power they had wielded, had come to this, a bargaining chip to purchase his own safety. He would be sacrificing the soul of his family's history in exchange for a longer, emptier life. Now, alone in the echoing hall, he felt trapped between two impossible choices. He lifted the lid of one chest, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, resting on faded linen, a large silver platter gleamed dully in the thin light filtering through a grimy window. The centerpiece was a depiction of his ancestor, Lucius, standing over a map of his new estates in Etruria, the very beginning of their fortune. The artist had captured a look of ruthless ambition in the silver face. Romulus wondered what that man, who had built their wealth from the ashes of a civil war, would think of his descendant, who was now tasked with presiding over its quiet dissolution. The choice was not between resistance and appeasement, he realized, but between two different kinds of endings, one loud, pointless, and swift, the other quiet, shameful, and slow. Part of him, the part that had been raised on tales of Roman virtue and ancestral duty, recoiled from the thought of appeasing the new master. It felt like a deep personal failure, a betrayal of every Cornelius who had come before him. Yet another, more practical part of his mind, the part that saw the weeds in the garden and the fear in the eyes of his few remaining servants, knew that survival was the only duty that mattered now. The world had changed, and the old virtues were luxuries it could no longer afford. To cling to them was to choose to drown while holding a stone bust of a forgotten god. He found himself thinking that perhaps this was how great families always ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet, agonizing decision made in a dusty room. He closed the chest, the soft thud of the lid sounding as final as a spadeful of earth on a coffin. The choice, he knew, had already been made the moment the chieftain's envoys had spoken. There was no real plot to join, no army to fund, only the ghosts of old senators chasing memories. There was only the cold, hard reality of the man who now held the city in his grip. The silver was a story of the past, but living, even in a diminished world, was a necessity for the present. In that silent hall, surrounded by the faded glory of his ancestors, Romulus made the choice to sacrifice memory for time. In the profound quiet, tracing the cold, smooth rim of a silver goblet, he could almost forget the weight of an empire's end waiting just beyond his crumbling walls. Thrasimund, a young man of the Goths, adjusted the stylus in his hand, its bronze cool against his skin. His task for the king's administration was simple but vast: to survey the public works of Rome, to document what still functioned and what had fallen into ruin. He walked through the area they still called the Forum, though now it was as much a pasture as a public square. Goats tore at the weeds growing between immense paving stones, their bells making a small, tinny sound that seemed out of place among the silent, towering columns. He squinted as the morning light caught the edge of an unbroken marble slab, a brief, sharp flash that made him turn his head away. For his people, victory was a matter of horses and swords, of loyalty to a chieftain, and the strength of one's arm. This place, however, spoke of a different kind of power, one built of stone and water, a power so old its origins were becoming a mystery. This understanding of a different past guided his steps toward a colossal structure of brick and travertine stone. He followed the path of a still-functioning aqueduct, its stone channel raised on mighty arches that marched across the landscape. The sound of running water was a constant companion, a low murmur that spoke of engineering so persistent it had outlasted the emperors who commanded it. The building it fed was a bathhouse, one of many in the city, but this one was noted in his records for its remarkable state of repair. Local people still came here, their chatter and laughter echoing from within its high walls. As he approached the main entrance, Thrasimund paused to touch the wall. The brickwork still solid, the mortar firm between the joints. He tried to imagine the amount of coin, the sheer weight of silver and gold required to raise such a mountain of a building. It was a scale of wealth his own people, even his king, could not truly comprehend. Stepping from the bright, open space into the entrance hall, the world changed. The sounds from outside vanished, replaced by the soft slap of sandals on the mosaic floor and the deeper echo of his own heavy boots. A sense of coolness rose from the stones, a welcome relief that made his shoulders relax. His task required him to ignore the bathers and focus on the structure itself. He moved through the series of rooms, his gaze sweeping upwards to the vaulted ceilings, some still covered in painted plaster, others showing the raw brick beneath where the finish had fallen away. In the warm room, a gentle vapor rose from the pools, and the quiet conversations of old men seemed to hang in the moistness. He made a note on his wax tablet. The hypocaust system, the underfloor heating that warmed the water and tiles, was still working perfectly. The ingenuity of it, a hidden fire breathing warmth through a building's very bones, was a source of constant wonder. This functional brilliance led him to the great central hall, the heart of the complex. Here, light poured in from high arched windows, illuminating a vast cold water pool. The water was so clear he could see the intricate patterns of the mosaic tiles lining the bottom. It was here, carved into the marble wall above the pool, that he found what he was looking for, the dedicatory inscription. The letters were wide and graceful, but centuries of dampness had worn them down. He moved closer, tracing the grooves with his finger to feel the words the eye could no longer easily read. He could make out the name of the patron, a senator of the Cornelii family, and the statement that he gave this gift to the people of Rome. The name meant little to him, just another entry in the old records of families long since vanished. Their ambitions, their politics, their struggles for power had all turned to dust. He sat on a stone bench, the chill of it seeping through his tunic, and looked from the faded name to the living building around him. The senator was gone. His family was gone. Their villas on the great hills were crumbling. Their precious silver plate melted down generations ago to pay for soldiers or bread. Their vast estates in the countryside were now worked by men who owed allegiance to new Gothic lords. All the furious energy they had spent acquiring and displaying their fortune had ended here, in this quiet, useful place. Thrasimund wondered about the man. Did he build this from a sense of duty, a love for his city? Or was it a simple calculation of power, a way to buy the affection of the crowds and ensure his family's name would be remembered? Perhaps it was both.
The result, he thought, was the only thing that mattered now. The senator's motives were as lost as his worldly possessions, but the baths remained. The water still flowed. The people still gathered. A young boy splashed happily in the great pool, his laughter bouncing off the high ceiling, and he did not know or care about the name carved in the marble above him. He only knew the joy of the cool water. The immense wealth of the Cornelii family, gathered through land and trade and political maneuvering, had been transformed. It was no longer a private fortune, but a public good, a thing that served the children of the conquerors just as it had served the children of the conquered. It was a strange kind of immortality, he mused, one that its creator may not have intended. He continued his survey, moving down into the service corridors below the main floor. Here, the air was cooler and smelled of damp earth and old stone. He saw the massive lead pipes as thick as his arm that carried the water from the aqueduct. He saw the furnaces, long cold, that had once roared with fire to heat the upper rooms. The scale of the labor required was staggering. Countless hands, most of them belonging to slaves whose names were never recorded, had dug these foundations and laid these bricks. Their lives were spent so that a senator's name could be carved in a hall, and so that, centuries later, the people of a changed city could still find a place for community and cleanliness. The money had directed the hands, but the hands had done the work, and their silent efforts were the true foundation of this place. As he emerged back into the light of the main hall, his survey complete, he saw a group of his fellow Goths, soldiers from the king's garrison, laughing as they lowered themselves into the cold pool. They were loud and boisterous, their pale skin and fair hair a stark contrast to the dark-haired Romans bathing nearby. Yet they shared the water. The old Romans, perhaps resentful, made space for the new masters of the city. The structure itself, built by a long-dead Roman aristocrat, served them all without prejudice. It was a silent teacher, showing how a city could endure even when its rulers and people changed. The stones did not care who you were, only that you were there.
Finishing his notes, Thrasimund put away his stylus. His report to the king would state that the baths of Cornelius were in excellent condition and required only minor repairs to the roof. It was a practical assessment for a practical king. But as he walked away, leaving the sounds of splashing water and echoing voices behind him, he carried a different understanding.
The great families of old Rome had spent their fortunes on spectacles and villas, on silks from the East and exotic animals for the arena. Most of that was gone, as short-lived as the applause of the crowd. Yet some of it, the portion they had poured into the city itself, had survived. The roads, the aqueducts, the bridges, and buildings like this one were their true legacy. He looked back one last time at the arches of the aqueduct, stark against the clear sky. A fortune was a powerful force, like a great river. It could be used to flood a field for a single season's gain, or it could be channeled to irrigate the land for 100 generations. The Cornelii, in their long history, had likely done both. But the channels they cut into the life of Rome were what remained. The water, channeled through conduits built by forgotten men and funded by forgotten wealth, had woven itself so completely into the city's existence that its flow was now as natural and necessary as the rising of the sun. And so, our journey through the immense world of Roman wealth finds its gentle end for the night. Imagine the great doors of a country villa closing, shutting out the day's commerce and politics. The only sounds are the soft murmur of a fountain in the central courtyard and the distant whisper of wind through cypress trees. The coolness of mosaic floors replaces the city's dusty roads, and the soft glow of olive oil lamps paints warm shadows on frescoed walls depicting tranquil myths. This ultimate luxury, the quiet stillness after a day of influence, is a peace we can all find in rest. Let the day's own demands fade away, much like the noise of Rome from a peaceful hillside estate. May you feel that same sense of profound calm and security as you settle in for the night. Sleep deeply and rest well.